Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Mike Chon. He's the Vice President and Senior Partner of Talent Transformation for the U.S. federal market at IBM Consulting. Mike, good to have you with us.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
And we've been talking to IBM about the use case-driven approach to artificial intelligence deployment in the federal government. And it turns out IBM has a case history, a use case of its own in the HR function that might be applicable, the lessons learned and so forth. Tell us about that change at IBM.
Yeah, well, IBM has been going through its kind of AI, HR digital transformation now for over 7 years. And, what I can tell you about it today is that, IBM has gained the efficiencies, it's delivered on the employee experience, right? It has achieved a lot of the, automations, I'll say, the productivity gains. And if you really look at our stats right now, you're looking at about 1.7 million HR conversations are occurring between our AI and our employees and managers internally. We have about 94%, resolution within the virtual agent, meaning once the conversation is started, it actually doesn't have to go to a live person. Now, I would love to tell you that that's how it was all planned out and it worked. That's exactly how everything worked out. But that's not the case, right? We had a lot of pitfalls. We had a lot of lessons learned. Right? We consider ourselves client zero when it comes to this stuff. So, what can we share and how is it relevant for our federal agencies? I believe a company like IBM that has gone through this, we can share our lessons learned with our federal agencies, hopefully help them avoid it as much as possible and share with them our lessons learned so that they can accelerate the adoption of AI.
And the functions that actually happen, it sounds like communications between employees that need something from HR, whether, change in station or some resolution of paychecks or something like that?
Sure. Yeah, it's really runs the full gambit when we think about employee self-service, right? And, I would also want to emphasize manager self-service because I actually think that's where the value really comes in. But this comes down to something as simple as saying, what are my holidays that are available to me, right? And really the chatbot, the AI should know who you are and give you your holidays for your location, for your employee type, right? But it can also range up to something like an employment verification letter, right? A lot of us, when we go out and try to go get loans, right, we typically will call our HR Shared Services Center, and ask for an employment verification letter. And as you can probably think, that takes days, even with some level of self-service. Now, inside of IBM, that really literally is a 1-minute task that can get done. So it really ranges, it goes through the gambit. And then on the manager side, right, it's really, this is where I think the value really starts to come in, right? When we talk about doing promotions, when we're talking about doing, transfers, when we're talking about, pay increases, those are much more complex transactions that require workflow. It requires a lot of logic. And again, that's something I will tell you in the past, we would say, hey, let's turn on self-service and managers will, take care of it, right? But we talk realities of what happens. Typical sentiment is what, hey, you're making me do more work as a manager is typically what that would come down as. And look, I'm a manager inside of IBM, right? I'm not just a consultant who talks about this stuff. And I'm going to be honest. We had self-service for quite some time inside of IBM, but I myself did not really adopt that paradigm because it wasn't easy for me to. Right? My muscle memory was to call my HR person, right? My HR business partner, whether it's through email or phone or chat. I will tell you, clock forward to today, and we've gone through the evolutions. If done properly, this will work. I myself now have a muscle memory. I actually tend to go to our AI chatbot more than our manager self-service products, let alone our HR people in there. In fact, I think I saw some stat out there I thought was pretty interesting. Our manager uptake right now is 96% adoption worldwide. And I think that's pretty huge, right? And it's 93% of transactions now in IBM worldwide is done through the AI chatbot. They don't even log into the back-end system. They just straight do it from the chatbot. So I think those are some interesting stats.
Yeah, now some of these functions are straightforward, like someone's days off. Doesn't really sound like artificial intelligence necessary. If it knows your name,
Sure.
there's a database of times off, it's cut and dried, there's no interpretation. But maybe maybe how does AI work in that scenario versus should I promote this person? Are they promotable? Are they eligible for promotion? Where there's many, many, many variables and judgment also involved.
So again, I think when just to make sure when we say AI, and let's not mix it up with generative AI, right? So
Sure.
And they are I would say two different things / evolution of one another. I would say the big part on AI piece on the let's call them, I forget what you call them, or the straightforward transactions.
Yeah.
Of that nature. I mean, it's as actually simple as something like the natural language processing, right? I mean, when someone actually interacts with an AI, you don't want them to memorize, hey, if you want that answer, you better type it in exactly like this for that answer to come. Because quite frankly, older chatbots, that's what it was, right?
Sure.
You needed to know the exact prompt to put in to get the answer. I think where AI has actually helped has increased with speed the variations that you can actually interact with your chatbot, right? So now it actually has this ability to learn and to take in many iterations of that same question. So no matter how you ask it, it will actually know the answer, how to get to the right answer. That's one. I think, the other interesting thing about AI is its ability to retain memory of a conversation. So if you are starting to go through a more complex transaction or a complex set of questions, it actually knows in context of your line of questioning to this AI. So to your point, if you're actually in the middle of a promotions transaction, and if you're starting to begin to ask questions like, hey, what is the current average salary of my direct staff in this area, right? As you're interacting with it, the AIs of today knows that context, right? So as you're starting to ask the next question, you don't actually have to remember and type in this very long question that has all the information all at once.
Right, so the human being then is free to really spend the time deciding whether to promote, and then once that decision is made, which obviously only a person can make, then all of the processing is speeded up.
And I want you to think about when there's that kind of back and forth. Like if I was talking to my HR, an actual person, that's what I would do. I wouldn't repeat myself.
Right.
Right. The entire sentence over and over again. It's a back and forth conversation. But that is not only the benefit of that. I want you to think about it from now. Now move that conversation to your phone, for instance. Right. The shorter back and forth text messaging type of interaction, that's very possible in an AI world, right? You're not sitting there crafting these very long emails. You're actually having a dialogue, and I think that's something AI has helped a lot in.
And of all the things that a large organization like an IBM does, and large organizations do many things, what made you choose HR as this first wave or the first place to apply transforming with AI?
Sure. There's a lot of reasons for that, but the one I think, meaning there's not one silver bullet answer that I can give you. But what I will tell you, I think one that's very valid for both IBM, and I think this is very valid for our federal workforce as well, is really we know AI is coming, if not already here, right? We know that with the presidential executive order, right, that this is only going to accelerate. So one of the things that HR can really do is help our workforce. Right? I mean, how do we prepare our workforce to adopt AI? Right? How do we enable them to adopt it as well as also better serve our citizens? So one of the things that HR really has an advantage on here is what is the one function that actually touches every employee, manager, and executive in your organization? That's HR. Right? So by introducing AI through HR, you're really having this ability to embed the use of these tools throughout your enterprise, right? And I think that really starts to, get people more comfortable with this, and that's what's happened to us, right? It was the one tool worldwide everyone had access to, and honestly, shortly thereafter, IBM started to introduce us to training. How do we get the skills? But really, the first step was getting us comfortable using it. I mean, to do real things like our own HR, our own pay, and so forth. And I think the next part of that is adoption, right, when it comes with this, right? And as I mentioned earlier, it's one thing to develop self-service tools, which we all have done, right? But it's a whole different ballgame to actually say you're actually getting your employees and managers to use this tool. And I really think AI, done properly, we're kind of at that point now where we are finally creating this experience that people actually want to use and can use.
And you can probably measure the abandon rate of queries that result in a phone call now versus then.
Absolutely. I mean, and we do it versus can you contain it within your agent, right? Because in the way, again, done properly, you try to give people a avenue out, right? So what that means is, we don't get them to a point where if the bot doesn't do what it needs to do, we don't just leave them there. We always give them an ability to actually connect to a live agent. So we do actually have those stats. And that's the number I was telling you earlier, that we do actually have a 93% rate of actual closing out the case within the virtual agent versus having them abandon it or go to a human being.
And I imagine this makes people better evangelists to your customers. It's almost like if you're going to sell cars, teach your people to drive.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's the one, I would say, we're all, for those of us who talk to our clients, we all worry about demos, right? I mean, everything that can go wrong does go wrong. This is the one tool I don't have to actually have a bunch of people get ready for me. I just show it to them what I use, live in our system, and it works great. And we do evangelize it because we know exactly how we use it, and we're very, very confident of it. So yeah, it does. And again, it makes us think of our own use cases. Sure. And allows us to translate that to our different functional areas or mission areas that we talk to our clients on. So I think it was really a brilliant way, quite frankly, of how to get our employees used to AI.
All right, we're going to talk about the federal application of this after we take a short break. My guest today is Mike Chon. He is the Vice President and Senior Partner of Talent Transformation for the U.S. federal market at IBM Consulting. I'm Federal Drive host Tom Temin on this discussion, Artificial Intelligence and a New Era of Federal Human Resources, sponsored by IBM here on Federal News Network. Welcome back to our discussion, Artificial Intelligence and a New Era of Federal Human Resources, sponsored by IBM here on Federal News Network. My guest today is Mike Chon. He's the Vice President and Senior Partner of Talent Transformation for the U.S. federal market at IBM Consulting. And Mike, before the break, we were describing IBM's own AI transformational journey in the HR function. Maybe just review for us the lessons learned, because it didn't happen overnight, as you said.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the big lessons, again, in the world of transparency, IBM does make mistakes ourselves, right? When we first started this journey, we went kind of like everything's got to be just right. It was this kind of really big bang approach. We spent a ton of time looking at our data. We looked at everything we can, and then we said we're going to get it just right, and we launched it. And as I mentioned to you before, just because you create a tool doesn't mean people will actually use the tool. And not only did we spend a lot of time, it wasn't quite there. The adoption pickup wasn't there. The tool wasn't quite right, and really it forced everyone to put a kind of a brakes on this process and say, let's really take this out and look back. And how do we, what is the right approach to this problem? And really, they decided to go down much more of a building block use case approach at this point, right? So what that means is, instead of sitting doing all this time prepping to get to the launch of AI, you actually go identify what is that high volume, high transaction, kind of your low hanging fruit, right? It's a repetitive process. It takes a lot of time, doesn't really add value from an HR perspective, but it does add, it is a moment that matters for the employee or manager.
Sure.
Right? And then they took that approach and say, okay, we're going to focus in on that, and that's going to be building block number one. That actually then starts to drive, is there a business process improvement that needs to occur with this? And then they start to look at, that actually drives the data that you need to actually approach. So they didn't try to boil the ocean and say, let's get every single HR data element in the possible right. They said, what is the HR data that we need to go and automate and make this particular use case available And when they start to take that approach, it really started to take off from there. And then they were starting to crank it out. So, and our CHRO has said this, like, they get it. And sometimes we do it wrong. And you have the ability to just take down that transaction, right? We tried it didn't work. And they would sit there and take that down. And you just constantly build out, and eventually you get to a critical mass. And I will tell you today, I guess as I mentioned before, I have this muscle memory now where I actually go to our HR virtual assistant. That's the first place I'll go to. That wasn't the case before. And every time I go now, I can see where actually the catalog is growing. It's just like almost like every week or so, if you go in, there's something new is coming in. And in the past, I would say when they do launch these new things, it wasn't always right. Now I would say, 7 years later, it is actually, each time they're launching stuff, this is actually getting better and better. And I can also tell our data is getting better as we go through this. Again, as long as people understand, you don't have to get it exactly right. And I think I heard our CHRO say 80%. Get it 80% right. Right? If you're at 80%, move forward with it. You'll get it close enough, and you'll keep improving from there forward.
Yeah, that's a key point. So even within a domain like HR, don't try to do HR, but try to do functions one at a time within HR. So maybe start with that looking up days off, which is relatively simple relative to some of the other higher level functions.
Yeah, in fact, the example I gave you before was one of the first ones. Employee verification. That was the transaction, right? Because it does take so much time for an HR person to put that together, send it out to folks, and people want that in a timely basis, right? And they're typically getting it because they're doing something like I said, getting a loan or something like that. And you're not thinking about getting a loan and getting the employment verification letter necessarily during work hours, right? And you don't like necessarily waiting in a queue and trying to figure out how's that going to get done. This gave them the ability to do it from home anytime they wanted to, and they got instant satisfaction because it happened right in front of them.
So what's your sense of how this could all be transferred, this learning knowledge, to the federal sector, where there's 2 million civilian employees and all these different agencies? It's really a big puzzle. I mean, where should they start, and where do you see the benefits going into the federal side?
Yeah, the first thing I'll say though is never seek the silver bullet, right? The answer is not the same clearly for everyone, right? But I would say that the first thing I would do is, we have a catalog. I'll say, almost think of it as a taxonomy of the use cases that IBM has already embarked upon, right? So if there's any lack of ideas of what are some of the use cases I could possibly do, I would say talk to someone that's already done it before, right? But I would say for each organization, there is going to be differences. Like, what is that moment that matters? What is that high volume transaction, right? What is the one that's going to have the highest impact? That is going to be different from an agency by agency perspective. I would encourage them to go through, there's many different words for how we do workshops to get you to that point. And it doesn't have to take, quite frankly, that long to do. Mm-hmm. We call ours the IBM Garage, but we would set up a garage session, walk our federal agencies through this process, through the taxonomy, bring in the right stakeholders, because it's not just, you don't just bring in HR people and say, okay, you guys decide, right? Bring in the right stakeholders together, and that will actually help propel them to say, what are the first experiments we want to go after, right? What are the right use cases to go after? And that first one is pretty important because it does start to set the table, right? And what are not just the technology, and I'll be honest with you, the technology is not the hard part. Right? Mm-hmm. It's doing the business processes, it's the stakeholder management, it's the change management pieces of things, right? But that first one will set the table on what are the technology components we're going to use initially. And once you do that, you can start to prioritize and start rolling out use cases. And like I said, 80%. Get yourself 80% and move forward.
Yeah, so it really is important to identify those high value, because you can easily imagine how, say, if your State Department deploying thousands of people overseas and moving them around all the time, very different issue than, say, an agency that everyone is local and they have a regulatory regime they have to follow or something or whatever. I mean, it's very domain specific.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And depending upon what they have today, is it pay-related questions? Is that going to be a high volume target, right? Is it time-related questions? Or maybe their pay and time's great, right? Maybe it is more about time off. It's a leave of absence. So those are things that we would tackle and say, what are those low-hanging fruits? And as I mentioned, I mean, a lot of times we tend to go after employee self-service. I really think when an organization really wants to see this high value come in, it's really manager self-service that also needs to equally be looked at.
Yep. What about hiring?
So that's a good question on the recruit and hire front. What I would tell you is that, number one, I think that, again, if AI is deployed correctly, you're going to actually able to get the bandwidth back of your HR professionals to tackle things like recruit and hire or other high value targets like maybe talent development. But in terms of AI, use of AI in hiring, I think that it depends. And I know there's a lot of solutions out there. There are generative AI solutions that help you generate things like position descriptions, right? Mm-hmm. There are AI solutions that will help you evaluate a candidate and so forth, help you accelerate that process. I will say, in all honesty, it depends on the organization and what mm-hmm. their appetite for some of the risks are that come with it, right? And there are inherent risks, I think, in this particular subject. I think it's getting better. I honestly do. I think the transparency is finally getting there. But I will say that it is one of the topics that, even within IBM, is something that we're taking slow in terms of leveraging, I will say, AI in the recruit and hire process directly. I think peripherally around it, we're definitely using it more from an automation perspective, like scheduling your own interviews maybe, those types of things, yes. Right. But in terms of actually helping evaluate candidates and such, we are looking into it, but we are still ourselves even taking a cautious step.
So you might say, for example, obviously the suitability of a person is going to be the human judgment, but maybe an algorithm and some automation could help you verify that at least what they say on the resume is true.
Yeah, and summarize it for you as well. Yeah, those are types of things I think it definitely can be used for. I think that we're not quite there yet in saying, let me score and bump someone up to the top. Because I think, again, it's not that our CHRO doesn't just straight out not accept that. I think he's just taking it in a much more cautious approach to it.
So basically then you really have to understand your own organization fundamentally. In that exercise, you can't get around before getting good at AI.
Well, I think it's also understanding the transparency of the AI, right? And I think this is a very important topic as well. I think if done correctly, you will be able to see the transparency, meaning when an AI makes, for instance, scores a candidate, well, why did it get that score, right? You need to have the ability to trace that, right? And be able to see the transparency of how that scoring happened. You can't accept it as a magic number, right? That someone comes in, and I think that's what I mean by that is that we have to know the transparency, the governance, and to really get to the point where you can trust the AI to do stuff like that.
Well, some fantastic advice. Thank you very much. My guest has been Mike Chon. He's the Vice President and Senior Partner of Talent Transformation for the U.S. federal market at IBM Consulting. I'm Federal Drive host Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, please visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search IBM.